You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Hi, I'm Annie in the US.
And I'm Johanna from Austria, and you're listening to your favorite international podcast. This is the true crime podcast that covers murder, but not only murder, also mystery and the macabre throughout history. And today, we have a very historic episode for you. Isn't that right, Annie?
Yeah, that's right. Because today, I want to tell you all about the assassination of President James A. Garfield. This case was suggested by my dad right when we first started the podcast 5 years ago. And he gave me a copy of, his copy of his book, The Biography of James A. Garfield by Ira Rutko. Other sources, and I have way too many to list them all, but they include, as in addition to the biography, the book Murdering the President, Alexander Graham Bell and the Race to Save James Garfield by Fred Rosen. That one has a foreword by Hank Garfield, who's like the great, grandson, and it's very interesting. Also, another great book is Destiny of the Republic by Candace Millard. There's also a PBS documentary called Death of a President, which heavily features discussions with Millard. There's also a great presentation on Garfield's care on YouTube by Jake Wynn of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And there are several other lectures and biographies, as well as a few fun videos I came across on the topic. And I've added all of those to a YouTube playlist, so we'll share that. There are articles from the National Parks Service, specifically the James A. Garfield National Historic Site, the millercenter.org, which is a nonpartisan affiliate of the University of Virginia that specializes in presidential scholarship. And as I said, newspapers of the time, Encyclopedia Britannica, and other sources I'll list as we go. So, there's so much to talk about. President Garfield is very much a forgotten president, at least I think for the average American. I saw him referred to more than once as the what-if president because he died so soon after taking office, but he had a lot of very strong feelings about abolition and Black suffrage, and you can't help but wonder what post-Civil War Reconstruction might have looked like had he lived. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. So the reason I'm going to be telling you about him today is that this is not a quick assassination story. This is a really twisted story of delusion and madness, a free love commune your family have probably supported without knowing it, and the absolute horrors of Civil War era medicine. So, buckle in. After his death, Garfield's assassin claimed as part of his defense that he had only shot the president and that it was his own doctors who had murdered him. And this is hard to argue with. And the story is sincerely gruesome at times. It's also a love story and a story of perseverance and a stringent reminder to wash your hands with soap.
Okay, I know nothing. I know he was assassinated, but that's pretty much it. And I'm very much intrigued by now because free love, what? And I'm always down for the horrors of medicine, so I'm absolutely ready. Let's go, let's do this.
Right? So it goes without saying that I'm only going to be skimming the surface of this whole story, and there's a lot of story to cover. It's always really hard to choose what to include and what to let go of, and if I get it wrong, I apologize. This is something that Johanna and I struggle with all the time. I think I struggle with it more than you do. You're like, it's fine. They know we can't tell them everything. And I'm like, but we have to. And you're like, no, it's impossible. Every week. Anyway, I'm only going to be discussing politics in the very vaguest sense of things pertinent to our story because we listen to podcasts to get away from politics and just nobody wants to talk about politics. So let's get into it. This is going to be at least a 2-part episode. We'll see how far we get today. And we're going to be talking about the most interesting aspects of the lives of the main characters in our story. James Garfield, his wife Lucretia, and his assassin, Charles Guiteau. Then next week, we're going to discuss how this all came about, the actual shooting, and the very, very long, slow, torturous death of a great man. All right, so yeah, this week it's like free love cult and some of their practices. Next week, don't listen to it while you eat, I think. All right, first, let's talk about Garfield the cat.
Oh, thank God, because as a European, I can tell you, back in the day when I first heard you had a President Garfield, I obviously immediately thought of like the cat.
The cat.
With a Lincoln head or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. You're definitely not alone in that one. I think when most people hear Garfield, they think lasagna loving orange tabby, right? So the cartoon Garfield, that was created by Jim Davis and launched in 1978. And he named Garfield after the president. Or more specifically, he named the cat after his grandfather, who was named James A. Garfield Davis. And he was named for the 20th president of the United States, James Abram Garfield. So, indirectly, the cat is named for the president.
That's a cool fun fact.
Isn't it? James Garfield's paternal family had emigrated. I literally included this tidbit because I know how to pronounce all these places. So his paternal family emigrated from Warwickshire, England, to Massachusetts around 1630. So they were very early settlers. Warwickshire is beautiful, and Warwick Castle is one of my favorite little tourist spots in England. But here we have Warwick, Rhode Island, whereas in the original Warwick, they do not pronounce the W. It's pronounced like 2 R's, Warwick, rather than Warwick. And James' father, Abram, which was short for Abraham, he was born in Worcester, New York, and he traveled to Ohio in late 1819 in order to collect his bride, right?
As one does.
As one does. That's right. And at this time, Ohio is like the frontier, you know? So this is a whole thing. He'd been promised to his neighbor's daughter, girl he'd grown up with, named Mehitable Baloo.
Love it.
What's that, the name?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't that sound cool?
It does.
Mehitable Baloo?
Mehitable Baloo. Yeah. So Mehitable, because you know I looked this up, was a popular Old Testament name during the colonial era in New England. So he arrives to find his promised fiancée, or she'd been promised to him. I'm not exactly sure how it works. I think they were like neighboring farms, and so like it was arranged and then they moved and he still kept his bargain, you know, that kind of thing. But their family had relocated to Ohio several years before in order to try to improve their station in life because they were living in such poverty in New York. So Abram schleps out approximately 550 miles or 885 kilometers to Ohio. And there he plans to see his beloved Mehitable and woo her and wed her now that they're of age, as you do. The only problem is he finally arrives and he learns that Hitty, which is her name, that's the nickname for Mehitable, Hitty. She had actually married one of her cousins, not 3 months previous. Classic wooing gone awry. It's terrible. And so he arrives and he finds that his plans are not to be, but I don't think he was particularly broken up about it. I don't think this was like a love match of any kind. You know, he was doing his duty. Hitty had a younger sister named Eliza. She was petite and beautiful and had a really interesting family. Her mother, Mehitable Ingalls, was known as a witty redhead who was renowned for her talent as a weaver. And as soon as I heard the name Ingalls, you know I wondered if there was any relation to Laura Ingalls Wilder of Little House on the Prairie fame. And yes, the National Park Service had informed me that they are cousins. 6th cousins twice removed, to be specific. I think that's like how I'm related to Henry VIII. It's like technically, but yeah, they are. Her father was James Ballou, a talented mathematician and a clairvoyant known as James the Astrologer.
What's going on in this whole story?
Right? This is not boring. None of this is
fascinating.
Right. This is the stuff your teachers didn't tell you about, but I'm going to tell you about. You read the history books for the war info. I'm here to tell you about the silverware sex cult and James the Astrologer. So he allegedly predicted his own death. We'll see if we have more time to discuss him later, maybe. But the point is, Eliza has both brains and beauty, and years ago, she maybe had been a bit smitten with this strapping young man. Long story short, they size each other up, they like what they see, and a few months later, they are married in February of 1820 in Perry Township, Ohio. When I first read how they had gotten together, I kind of felt bad for her. I was worried that Eliza was maybe the second choice, but I don't think that was the case at all. I think they actually were a very happy match that turned into quite a love match.
Also, we shouldn't forget the concept of love and a romance was very different back then.
Very different back then. You wanted a partner to survive with, which you should still have today, but now I want more. So Abram is farming, and Eliza was a talented singer with a beautiful voice and a seamstress, and she just kept a very happy home. When the Ohio and Erie Canal began work in around 1825-ish, Abram began working on the canal. It was really hard labor, but he was a big, strong guy and up to the task. In the meantime, they were raising a family of 4. They had 4 children. Mehitable was their first daughter, who would also be called Hitty. I guess the only other option, if your name is Mehitable, it's like Hitty, or it would be Table. You wouldn't call someone Table.
Tabby.
Tabby. Yeah. Meh.
Meh could be like a
I like meh.
If they would have been mad at the sister who married another guy,
right,
then it would be like meh.
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 I love it. Hitty is born in 1821, then Thomas in 1822, Mary arrived in 1824, and James Ballou Garfield in 1826. One night in January of 1829, their youngest, who they called Jimmy, was suddenly stricken with a fever on the night that Abram was out. I think it would be not uncommon for a man to be out for nights at a time because simple errands could take a week, So Abram's just not at home at the time. She's all alone at home with her 4 children, and her youngest dies in her arms. Just because these things happen with heartbreaking frequency at this period of time, it doesn't mean that every loss isn't just as devastating, right? So Eliza was deeply depressed and turned to religion for comfort. Soon she was thrilled to find that she was expecting again, and when the baby was born, she was very grateful to be given another son. She named him James after the older brother that he had lost, but his middle name was Abram after his father. So this is also something really common at that time. I'm glad they gave him a new middle name, though. Sometimes in research, especially if you are familiar with looking at old census records, especially doing my dad's genealogy, because the last name is Jackson, and you'd find like James Jackson, and then the next record would be, oh wait, that's actually a different baby because he was 3 5 years ago and now he's 1. You know what I mean? And you'd see this over and over and over again at this time all over the world. It's not just with this case. It was just really common to keep naming. That seems so strange to me today, doesn't it? That's one of the stranger sort of things.
Yeah. I don't think that a lot of people would do it nowadays.
No. I mean, I think it's totally fine to name a child after a deceased sibling. I just think maybe mix up the middle name. Just my own personal. I'm not judging. Anyhow, James Abram Garfield, he's born on November 19th, 1831, but the family's happiness would not last long. When James was only 2, his big, tall, strong father had gone to help in the containment of a forest fire.
Yeah, back then, no real fire departments, especially in the more rural areas, and everyone had to work together to protect the land they were living on and keep your family basically from worse poverty than you were already living in.
Exactly. And the Garfield family was very rich in love, but materially very poor. Literally dirt poor. He is the last of the so-called log cabin presidents, and their cabin in Orange, Ohio, had a dirt floor. That's where that term comes from, dirt poor.
Mm.
And I don't think James had shoes until he was 4 or 5. So this is, the priority is food on the table and a fire in the hearth. But right now, he's only about 1.5 years. I don't think he was quite 2. And his father dies, and that's the end of 1833, and it just absolutely devastates the family.
Also, his father died in the fire.
No, he didn't die. Sorry, he didn't die in the fire. So they were fighting a fire, and I think the fire was contained, but in the process, he caught a chill. He got sick. I think probably something like pneumonia, because they say he caught a chill and died, but we know that's not how illness works. You don't just get cold and die. So I'm not exactly sure what his cause of death was, but I would guess pneumonia. And so he is quoted as saying to his wife just before he died, quote, "Eliza, I have planted 4 saplings in these woods. I leave them in your care." End quote. Even with his parents, the focus was always on the love and trust they had in one another and their commitment to their children. And she took excellent care of her family. James grew up in a home where there was so much happiness. His mother filled the house with songs, and she told her children stories all about the big, handsome man who had left them all too soon. It's like, my mom was like that. Like, I never met my grandmothers, but I feel like I did because she told me so many stories about them. And that's exactly what happened with Eliza, and especially James, because some of the older children, of course, did remember their father, but James was too little. I think partly they got by maybe with some help from Eliza's brother-in-law, as well as the sale of some land. She may have worked as a seamstress to kind of supplement the income. And as the years go by, it becomes clear that the baby of the family was very bright, gifted. This kid is wicked smart. One of the best accounts of the intelligence of Garfield, just to kind of make you understand what we're talking about here. So he was naturally left-handed, but was ambidextrous, meaning that he could write with either his right or his left hand. Later on, as a young man at university, like high school university age, he would learn both Greek and Latin. All of these things are skills, right? Garfield could sit down at a desk with a pen in each hand and paper and write Greek with one hand and Latin with the other at the same time.
Who are these people? Mm-hmm. And I mean that in the most impressed way possible.
Right.
Because usually when we say that, it's like...
terrible.
A rather negative way. But
I know.
This... what?
He's so smart. He's next level smart. He's not just smart. It's very Sheldon Cooper-y kind of smart, but he's also very emotionally intelligent. Like, he's very affable and gregarious. We'll get into that. Okay. So his older brother, Thomas, he was only 9 years older than James, but at the age of 11, he stops going to school and goes to work so that he can help support the family and get enough money to make sure that his little brother has an education. Eliza has a small schoolhouse built on their land because, remember, this is Ohio and there is no schoolhouse. Everybody's being homeschooled. And so she builds this little log cabin schoolhouse, and her nieces and nephews and some of the area's other children all attend. At the age of 16, James is now this big, strapping young man who took after his father, and he is longing for adventure. He really wants to sail the 7 seas. He just needs some experience first. And so, much to his mother's dismay, he runs off to work in the canals connecting Pittsburgh and Cleveland, where one of his cousins was working. Canal work is a tough job, even if you did know how to swim and he did not. It wasn't all the falling into the water and almost drowning that made him reprioritize. It was the malaria. Oh, thwarted again. So he has to go home so that his mother can sort of nurse him back to health. And Eliza was so happy to have her son home. And while recovering, James realized that, you know what? Maybe the life of adventure wasn't for him, and he should try to apply himself to this education thing. His mother and brother had scraped together the $16 needed to send him to the Geauga Seminary, which was a Free Will Baptist school in Chester, Ohio, which is in Geauga County. I really hope I've pronounced that correctly.
That's an interesting name.
Yeah.
Is it named after someone? Is it a last name?
I didn't look into it. So he would spend 2 years here at Geauga, working as a teacher in a local school to help support himself. It was here that he found he had a true love for learning, and he was brilliant. He especially loved math and science. When I say science, I mean the natural sciences. And he had an obvious natural aptitude for languages. It's also here at Geauga that he meets a young lady named Lucretia Rudolph. Lucretia, who was known as Crete, was born in Garrettsville, Ohio on April 19, 1832. She was the first of 4 children born to, such a good name, Zebulon and Arabella Mason Rudolph.
Zebulon is the name of the grandfather of the Waltons.
Ugh, isn't it a good name?
It's such a good name. And the funny thing is, in German, they named him Sam.
Sam?
Yeah.
I wonder if it's the same as, I'm just making the connection now, of Zeb's General Store in North Conway, New Hampshire, which I'm wondering if that's short for Zebulon as well.
Maybe. But it's such a good name.
It's good, right? And Arabella, another beautiful name. So let's talk about Crete's family. Her family were loving and supportive, but they did not show affection to each other. They were much, much more reserved than the average family at that time, and like polar opposite of Garfield's, right? Because she had been somewhat sickly as a kid, it said that she spent a lot of time in bed with breathing problems, which make me wonder if maybe she had asthma when she was little or some kind of allergy that she grew out of. But she spent a lot of time as a kid in bed with books to keep her company, which I'm sure I'm not alone in relating to that. And one of my absolute favorite quotes of hers is, quote, "It would be of about as much use to stop breathing as to let books alone if they are anywhere in the region about me. I have to read as I have to live," end quote. Her parents, they weren't outwardly affectionate, but every indication is that they loved her very much because, while she of course learned what all young women of that time did, like cooking and cleaning, sewing, and all the things that she would need to run a home, her parents also decided that she should have more of a formal education. So she went to her local grammar school and then on to Geauga, where she would meet James Garfield. This, I think, is maybe a good time to talk about what James and Crete look like. Are they the most attractive first couple? I think maybe yes. James is very handsome. He's got this wild riot of dark, thick hair and very full pouty lips with these incredibly piercing light blue eyes. James has the kind of eyes that cause other men to be misidentified as a post-mortem photo. You know, like any other guy, you'd see this photo in a forum and there'd be 100 people going, he's dead. You'd never think James Garfield was dead, though. He's got too, I don't know, he's too vibrant looking, right? Who is he played by in the made-for-TV in Hallmark After Dark? Who, I was thinking maybe Chris Pine, like a young Chris Pine, because he's got like, he's kind of a big guy with pale eyes.
Maybe, yeah.
And then Crete is this stunning portrait of pale skin and very dark hair and eyes. I'm thinking like young Winona Ryder, maybe?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think?
He's very good looking. Like the eyes are intense. I just love men with blue eyes.
Yeah.
And he has this full head of hair that reminds me a lot of the Wilson brothers from the Beach Boys in the 1960s. Well, Brian Wilson still, for his age, has a really good head of hair.
Yes, he does.
So,
spoiler alert, later on in life, he's going to be a bald man with a beard. But I know you, and you know me, and we like a bald man with a beard. Yes, we do. No one's mad about that fact. So Guaga really helps James find his confidence, right? He's like, this is it. This is what I'm good at. I'm smart, you know? The problem was he still wasn't really sure what he wanted to do. Shocking. He's an 18-year-old. This is normal, right? He's been supporting himself by teaching children and working as a carpenter, and he feels that maybe his aptitude for learning will be the thing to set his path in life. So he then attends the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute, and there he would find his friend Lucretia from Guaga already attending, which makes sense because her father had helped to found the school. Today, it's known as Hiram College. While he was there, he worked as the school's janitor to make ends meet, and then he also ended up teaching some subjects while he was still a student, including Crete in his Greek class. That picture we have of the two of them is a close-up. I'll show the whole picture, but it's of that Greek class when they were first spending a lot of time together. And I know I keep going on and on about how sexy his brain is because, seriously, but he was also a lot of fun. He's kind of the total package. Like, he's handsome, he's smart, he's funny, he's fun. He liked to fish and hunt, he played billiards, and when it came to the temperance movement, which was popular at the time, he wasn't a heavy drinker. He never had any problem with alcohol, but he also had no interest in the temperance movement. Also during this time, he had work as a preacher regularly and visited area churches, and this actually made him a little bit more money, helping him to support himself. He was a really eloquent speaker, and so I think he did really well as a preacher. Another unsurprising interest for the young man was the ladies. So he dated several girls, including Crete, and I think Crete was probably a standout because she was so intelligent. She was really smart, witty. She's beautiful, obviously. But I think probably the thing that really bonded him, really attracted him to her in the first place was this is probably the first woman he's met who has a thirst for knowledge that is anything close to his own, you know?
Well, also she, from what you said, she was backed up by her family because, I mean, I'm pretty sure there were lots of young women who had a thirst for knowledge, but it was just not what they were supposed to do.
Exactly.
They had to look pretty and be able to cook and sew and run a household.
And I think this is why I think I feel comfortable saying that I know her parents loved her a lot, because although they were not demonstratively affectionate, which would actually be a problem for her in life, there were other ways in which it was clear that her life mattered to them, right? So after the Eclectic Institute, he travels to beautiful, beautiful Western Massachusetts, where he attended Williams College as a junior. He was 23 years old and by far the oldest in attendance at the school at that time. So that's a nice reminder that it is never too late to learn. I mean, 23, you're still such a baby, but life expectancies were different and all that jazz. Creek took up a teaching job while James was out east. She valued her own independence. She liked having the ability to teach and have her own income, that she would never necessarily have to depend on a man. And so they're writing letters to each other, over 1,200 letters before his death. This really peaked when James visited Niagara Falls, and upon seeing the falls, he just had to write and tell Crete all about it because she wasn't there to see it herself. And then they became engaged in early 1854, which is, one source I read, I think, said that this was when they shared their first kiss. So that's sweet. But they're not getting married anytime soon because he still needs to graduate from Williams, and he does that in 1856. Then he comes back to the Institute where he teaches his specialty, classical languages, but also math, geology, history, and English. He really loved to debate, and he left Williams with very strong abolitionist feelings. His feelings for Crete were less certain. James has been quoted as saying in a letter to a friend, quote, "There is no delirium of passion nor overwhelming power of feeling that draws me to her irresistibly," end quote.
Okay, that's not what a young woman would love to hear, but I have to say passion in the beginning of a relationship is very much overrated. Passion that develops over time is where it's truly at.
Agreed. And so, well, in the months leading up to the wedding, they both had kind of cold feet, and they both sort of felt like they were marrying because they had to. You got to remember, he proposed and then left her. So it would have been sort of ungentlemanly, I think, to have been seen as stringing her along. You know what I mean? Like, if you didn't want to marry her, don't go away for a few years. Like, tell her before that. And as for Crete, she did love him, and we have a letter from her to him. I think she was trying to let him out of it. And there's a part of it that reads, quote, "There are hours when my heart almost breaks with the cruel thought that our marriage is based upon the cold, stern word, duty." End quote. Nonetheless, they're married on November 11th, 1858 at her family's home, and they move into a boarding house because they can't afford a house of their own. She even sent him an invitation to their wedding as a joke. Yeah, Crete is... There's a lot under the surface of this woman. So she's teaching, James is at the Institute and teaching himself law in spare time. So he's like, yeah, why not? He passes the Ohio bar in 1861. So he leaves the Institute. By the way, while at the Institute, in the couple of years that he was there, he went from being a professor to being basically the dean of the college. Because why wouldn't he be? The thing he didn't like was all the faculty bickering. He was just like, I just can't handle. He just wanted to teach and learn. So he had joined the newly organized Republican Party as he was very much against slavery. And in 1859, he was elected to the Ohio legislature. Their first child, who they named Eliza after her grandmother, was born in 1860. They called her Lil Trot or Trotty after the Dickens novel. And she was a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful baby. We have pictures of her. In 1861, James left the family to join the Union war effort and fight against the Confederacy. He believed that the South needed to be, quote, beaten to its knees, saying, quote, "It is well known that the power of slavery rests in the large plantations, and that the bulk of all the real estate is in the hands of the slave owners who have plotted this great conspiracy. Let these men go back to their lands, and they will again control the South. If the slaveholders continue to have power, they would use that power to the detriment of the freed people, and that would call into question all the blood and treasure that had been expended during the war." End quote. So I'm not going to get into all the Civil War politics. If it's a little bit confusing about why a Republican would want to seize Southern property and punish plantation owners, so this is a huge oversimplification, but basically pre-Titanic, pre-1912, the Republican Party, it was a liberal party, and the Democratic Party at that time was conservative, again, painting with broad strokes. At this time, Democrats were primarily in the South, Southern states, and the Republicans were primarily in the North. Don't get me wrong, not all of those Northern liberal Republicans wanted to stop slavery because they cared about the rights of Black people. Some of them just knew their family farms couldn't compete with plantations and hundreds of slaves. I'm also not saying that people in the South didn't care about freeing the slaves and abolition and equal rights. It's a really complicated but fascinating history, and I really encourage anyone who's finding this mildly interesting to read more about it. There are also a lot more parties. It's not a two-party game yet. You've got Whigs and Copperheads, and you could have a liberal Republican as the Democratic candidate for office. So just long story short, don't confusingly tie today's meaning of those political terms with what they meant back then, because it's not an apples to apples comparison.
No. See, and that's what I love about history. The more you read and the more you learn, the more you see that the world is insanely complicated and there's barely ever a simple black and white, but it's so much gray and so many different kinds of gray.
Absolutely. And especially when you get into really, I don't know, I've had so much disillusionment in my adulthood reading about the Civil War versus what we were taught in school. And I think I know I'm not alone in that one. It's just so much of a more nuanced, anyway, you know what I mean. So James goes off to fight, and Crete takes baby Eliza to her parents' house, And this was the start of several years that they would later refer to as their years of darkness. They didn't really have the best relationship at this time. James had grown up in this very loving and affectionate relationship, and he thought Crete was very cold and unfeeling. For her part, I think Crete was very much in love and very passionate about her husband, but had grown up in a family that didn't show it, and she didn't know how, you know? Also at this time, poor Crete, his mother is living with them. Her husband's gone, and she's just home with a baby and her mother-in-law most of the time. Don't get me wrong, her mother-in-law's amazing. She loves her mother-in-law, but it's nobody's idea of the perfect beginning to a marriage, right?
Yeah.
In the meantime, James is distinguishing himself as a very skilled leader. On January 6, 1862, tasked with driving the Confederate forces from eastern Kentucky. I love that. They were like, listen, what we need you to do is get all of these Confederates, just get them out of Kentucky here. He's like, okay, fine. So he has under his command his own 42nd Ohio. He also has the 40th Ohio Infantry, 2 Kentucky infantry regiments, and 2 cavalry units. They are approaching Paintsville, which is held by Confederate Brigadier General Humphrey Marshall, and they have numbers that are pretty much the same as the number of troops that Garfield has. So he takes a look at the situation and is able to come up with a plan and position his troops in such a way that even though they had the same number of troops, the enemy thought that they were gravely outnumbered and ran away. Run away, run away. And so Garfield is like, after them. And so they do. And this is a tremendous success. And he is promoted to Brigadier General himself. Couple of quick things to note that I read while reading about his Civil War career. He seems to have had a very strong moral compass and was someone who had a real sense of justice. And while he was, I'm not saying he was a perfect man, don't get me wrong. We'll see. But after this battle, basically, he's the boss in this area right now, right? He is the highest ranking Union military official after they have, put the Confederacy back on the run. And so he makes an announcement to be clear so that every Confederate left in the area understands that they will be pardoned if they just go home, stay peaceful, and remain loyal to the U.S. And I don't think that would have been the case for a lot of people in this situation. There are more military battles, but it's not what we're here for. And then that summer, he becomes ill with dysentery. Johanna, we've discussed dysentery before, right?
We've discussed it a couple of times, but very on the surface, I think.
Yeah, it's bad news. It's the bloody diarrhea. Yeah. Nobody wants the dysentery. And it killed over 50,000 soldiers in the Civil War. James is sent home to recover. And he and Crete, she's so happy. She's like, yay, my husband has the terrible diarrhea and he's coming home for me to care for him. Probably legit. So they get to move into their first ever home, just the two of them, in Howland Springs, Ohio. And there he recovers. And they have a kind of honeymoon of sorts. And he's just happy. He absolutely falls in love with his daughter, who is now a toddler. He admits that, he didn't really know what to do with them when they're really little, like infants, but once they're toddlers and sort of able to engage, he's all in. And then he needs to leave again. Crete calculated that their first 6 years of marriage, they only had spent 6 weeks together. And I think that's probably something a lot of military spouses can commiserate with, huh?
I can absolutely relate. But I often tell my husband that we are so privileged because of modern technology. We are in almost constant contact and we see each other every single day because of video calls. How lucky are we to live today and not back then when all you had to look forward to were 1,200 letters? And they still managed. You know what I mean?
They did. Yeah, absolutely. I felt the same way during the pandemic, compared to the 1918 flu, same thing, right? We couldn't visit our loved ones, but at least we could usually see them.
And nobody set our houses on fire like they did in the plague times.
That's right. The worst. I'm not dead yet. All right. So on October 11th, 1863, the Garfield's second child was born, a son that they named Harry Augustus, and they called him Hal. James called him Little Chickamauga because the battle had just happened and he was a part in it. I'm not getting into any more Civil War battles. There's no time. 2 months later, just 2 months after their first baby boy is born, the slight sore throat that little Trot had recently been suffering from would take her life in an absolutely horrific way. Diphtheria. I think diphtheria is one of the worst.
Yeah, it can literally, I think, slowly basically strangle you while your loved ones can do nothing but watch. They stand by and watch.
I think the first tracheotomies were done to try to help diphtheria patients because your throat swells so much that you literally strangle. Awful, awful, awful. And I can't. She was only 3 years old and her parents were absolutely devastated and their shared grief would bring them even closer together. But come December, James is in Washington awaiting orders. What happened was, all right, here's what happened. So he had been elected to the House of Representatives without ever running. And he wanted to go back to the war. But President Lincoln was like, you know what? We actually have a lot of good men fighting for the Union, but we need your brain in Washington to figure out what we're going to do when this is all over. So he goes. I mean, your president tells you he needs you, you go. Crete is again home in Ohio, and he's now in D.C., and she's lonely when he leaves. And this, it seems, is when he has an affair. He may have had more than one. I don't know the extent to any of them. The main one was with a New York Times reporter stationed in Washington, one Miss Lucia Calhoun. I don't know if it was even a physical affair. It might have only been an emotional entanglement, but whatever it was, he actually confesses it to Crete, and she is furious and heartbroken. She's had it, and she basically says, you have to commit to this marriage and this family, or you need to give me a divorce, because I am not, no. And so he promises her, he says, nope, this marriage, our family, this is it. And so I think it's at her request that he then travels to New York, I assume to meet this woman, and he gets all the letters that he sent her. And then he burns everything that they wrote each other, as Crete had asked him to do. Ms. Calhoun does not suffer any consequences from this. As far as I can see, she had a good marriage not long after, and I think it was all happy times. And again, I mean, I'm not in any way excusing his intimacies with another woman outside of marriage, although we don't really know. It was something that he felt the need to confess to his wife, so obviously it was a problem. I just think their love story is it kind of reminds me of the plot of a romance novel, right? She loves him with all his heart, but had grown up in a family with good finances, but not a lot of affection. And James was totally the opposite, right? Dirt poor, but this loving family. And he's much more outgoing. He felt like a friend the minute you met him. You know what I mean? And she, as he said, just was very cold. And so I suspect that he didn't think she cared. You know what I mean? I don't think he was running around on her to be cruel. I think he just didn't think she cared that much. But then he suddenly realizes that actually she does care. She cares very much. She just doesn't express passion the way that he does.
I think it's a very recent thing that we realize that there are different ways to express love. That's what we nowadays call love language.
Exactly. So yeah, that's it. So they decide that this isn't what they want. They don't want this strife. They don't want this coldness between them. And they resolve to work on things. I think he may have actually read some of her diary entries so that she could basically tell him things that she couldn't say. Do you know what I mean?
This is very forward thinking for the time.
Very, very.
That's almost couples therapy levels of working on things.
Exactly. And this is it. It feels like a strange dichotomy to say, he loved his wife and was very respectful of her while he may have been unfaithful in some ways. But I think he respected her intellect and just trusted her. There's different kinds of respect, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. A lot of men will be married to a woman and never cheat on her or do anything wrong, but they don't necessarily respect her mind, her thoughts and want her input on important things, matters of state. And he did. He really trusted this woman. Do you know what I mean? I think that's pretty powerful, especially at this time. So they're working on things. Crete visits D.C. in early 1864. And in the fall of 1865, their third child, James Rudolph, was born in Ohio. And now it seems like Crete finally is getting that really loving home life she always wanted, and she stayed in Washington with him for a while. And that is where their daughter Mary was born on January 16th, 1867. And they called her Molly. I don't know why maybe because she had not named Mary, so Molly to differentiate. In 1869, the Garfields permanently relocated to D.C. This is the first home they owned together and the first time that they're living together for an extended period of time, because previously they were sort of going back and forth between D.C. and Ohio. Here, they are blessed with 3 more children, and they were exceptionally close to their children, especially for that time. The next child born was Irv. That's Irvin McDowell Garfield. He was named for a Union general, and he was born in 1870, and then Abram arrived in 1872, followed by the baby of the family, Edward, who they called Little Nettie, and he arrived on December 26, 1874. His sister Molly was disappointed she didn't get a baby sister, but everybody was very happy. And then tragedy struck. The following is from the National Parks Service. Quote, on Thursday, October 19th, 1876, James Garfield reported in his diary that, quote, little Nettie is still quite ill, although not so ill that Garfield felt it necessary to postpone a campaign trip. But by the time he returned to Washington, 4 days later, the little boy was no better, and the doctor had diagnosed whooping cough. On October 24th, Garfield said, quote, the spectacle of that beautiful boy, struggling so bravely for life, fills me with the very helplessness of sorrow. End quote. Nettie died the next morning, having lived not quite 2 years. He was buried beside his sister, Eliza Arabella, a.k.a. Little Trot, in Fairview Cemetery in Hiram, Ohio. James and Lucretia felt these losses greatly. It was somewhat common to lose young children to disease during that time period. However, the Garfields were very close to their children. They said that it was like, quote, the tearing of the atoms of their hearts to lose these 2 precious ones. End quote.
I remember that when I was way, way, way younger, I always thought, back in the day, people were used to losing their children, so it probably wasn't such a big thing. And as I grew older, I realized how foolish that thought was.
I used to think the exact same thing. Yeah, I think we just used to think it just used to happen all the time. And so I think it's easier to think that it's easier for us to think that it doesn't hurt, because then it hurts us less. It's the same reason that the kind slaveholder trope was so popular, It just makes us feel better about things if we can imagine it that way. And it's never a good thing to be united in grief, but I think I'm not alone in thinking that, it seems like it either pulls you closer together or it causes a rift. It's like one of 2 things happens, generally speaking. Not always a negative rift, just a lot of people that were super close to my late husband, I didn't see after he died. It was too painful for them to see me, and I've never begrudged anybody that, but it happens. But thankfully, when they lost their first child, Trotty, it brought them closer, and it just grew and grew and grew and grew. And so by the time they lost Nettie, they had tremendous love and respect for one another. Crete wasn't a typical politician's wife. She didn't really have any interest in hosting parties, but she was his most trusted advisor, and he consulted with her on all manner of things. She supported him by going to watch his speeches. The family went to the Jersey Shore in the summer for vacations to cool off, and we told you all about that in one of our first episodes. Nobody was eaten by a shark this time, and this is the prequel. They also bought a farm in Ohio where the children would spend their summers. There's a piece that I would love to share with you. This was written by their daughter Molly after her father's death, and it was published in the Youth's Companion in 1893. I'm not going to share the whole thing. I just wanted to share a few excerpts with you because right now in our story, all of the children are children, and this gives a really nice look into who he was as a father. It reads, in part, quote, "My father was not only our guide and counselor, he was our comrade. He was interested in all we were thinking about and doing. He was the director of our work, the willing sharer of our play. None of us will ever forget the many rhymes and jingles, together with all the good and wise sayings he taught us between courses at the dinner table, that hour of the day when children are most irrepressible." To one of his nature, how simple was the transition from the relation of parent to that of playmate. We were always happiest when he joined in our games of push in the corner or blind man's bluff. Father had a keen appreciation of harmless jokes and was always in sympathy with the joker, no matter if the laugh were at his own expense. My father's faculty of mixing work and play was well shown when, in order to cultivate our observations, he planned walks, during which we were to take mental notes of all we saw, and on our return were to tell him what we remembered, even to the minutest detail. One winter, he read to us selections from Audubon, and in connection with those readings, a visit was made every week to the Smithsonian Institution, where we saw the veritable beasts and birds, so lifelike that we never forgot them. With the same unflagging interest and enthusiasm, he read to us Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare. In later years, we realized how much more we enjoyed seeing and reading the plays from having become first familiar with the stories so simply and charmingly told. As Father believed there was no place like a farm for children, it was our good fortune to have a generous taste of country life. For 6 or 7 months of the year, we lived out of doors. We were initiated by him into all the mysteries and delights of farm life, and laid away a goodly store of health, strength, and vigor. The farm was Father's haven of rest, the only place where he felt he could breathe freely. He entered into all our outdoor sports with a rollicking, almost boyish zest, and enthusiasm akin to our own. At one period, croquet was the sport of the day, and when Father took the mallet, we knew we had a vigorous opponent to deal with. In looking back over those years so full of exertion, trial, and harassment to him, it is incredible that he was able to give us so much of his time and thoughts. No duties of his long public career were so arduous, no position of political preferment was ever so high as to exclude companionship with his children. The day of the tragedy and darkness came, and there passed from our eyes, but never from our lives, one of the dearest comrades, one of the staunchest friends, one of the most noble fathers children ever had. End quote. Mary Garfield Stanley Brown. Now we're skipping forward. Garfield represents Ohio's 19th district as a congressman, and he's done that for 9 terms, and he was the leading House Republican. In 1880, the Ohio legislature elected him to the Senate. Now get ready for another massive oversimplification, because I've read articles and chapters of books that are just on the convention. We don't have time for that. So it's 1880. It's the Republican National Convention. And Garfield has agreed to go and give a speech in support of Treasury Secretary John Sherman. So he's basically going to go and say, I think John Sherman should be the nominee for president from our party, and this is why. Other people nominated at the convention were James Blaine and Ulysses S. Grant. People are giving speeches as to why they should vote for these people, and then they take a vote, right? So I think it should be this person. Someone else gets up, I think it should be this person. Garfield gets up and is like, please vote for Sherman, and here's why. And so then they take a vote, and they can't get a majority. And they keep doing this over and over and over again, like 36 times in total. And so finally, someone on the Wisconsin delegation is like, the hell with these people. This is ridiculous. Let's just nominate Garfield. His speech was amazing. Let's see how that goes. So when they're reading one of these ballots, it's like, oh, Garfield. And people are like, Garfield, you know what? He did give a good speech. He's a great compromise. And that's how Garfield, who only went into politics at Lincoln's request, and I don't think ever campaigned for any of this, becomes the dark horse presidential candidate. He's the dark horse nominee. And he is quoted as saying, "This honor comes to me unsought. I have never had the presidential fever, not even for a day," end quote. Which probably would have made him a truly excellent president, at least in terms of him being in it for the right reasons, because his president asked him, because the country needs him, because this is a really, really difficult, painful, complicated time in the history of the United States. And he has the intellect to maybe make things better.
I honestly love everything I heard so far. I love what his daughter said about him. Like, he seems like really a down-to-earth, level-headed guy, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is probably a good time to stop, because I'm just looking at the time, and I think if I move into my next chapter, this episode's going to be too long. So I'm going to save it for next week, because we have to talk about a little bit less, much less, but a little bit on the background of the assassin, which is another, that's when we're going to talk about the sex cult a little bit next week. And then the assassination. Oh, and then this is a juicy story. Dad was right. Dad's always right. Honestly.
I'm so glad he suggested that to you, because so far, this is crazy.
I know.
And interesting. Really looking forward to next week and hear more about this. I'm not American. I don't know a whole lot about American presidents. Like, I think I recognize most names, and I obviously know about the Lincoln assassination. I mean, we covered that, and I know a little bit about George Washington, all these things. But Garfield, as you said, all I think is lasagna.
Yeah.
I find it fascinating.
His life and death are by far the most interesting things about him, with the actual shooting being just a blip, really. I just couldn't, as I was researching him to tell the story of his death, you just kind of want to give a little bit of background, but I was like, what would I have cut from this? I don't know. I think this was all kind of important. I cut a lot, but, All right. Do you have something good this week?
It's still with jam, but there's some good news. I hope people are not getting tired about this whole jam stories.
Never.
I mean, it's what's occupying my mind right now. So yesterday, yesterday we went to the university clinic, the veterinary medicine university clinic, to see the neurologist. And I was honestly relieved after talking to the neurologist, because he said, usually the first symptoms show around the age of 6 or 7 in the dogs, right? And Jem is going to be 9 next month.
Yeah.
And now looking back, of course, there were signs for a long time already, but nothing severe, nothing that you could put your finger on.
No,
right?
No.
The tremors and the shaking that started like maybe slightly 9 months ago.
I was going to say, it's just in the last year.
Yeah, definitely not longer than a year. And at first I just thought he's stressed, because when I just then talked to him, and it was only when we were eating. And anyway, and the doctor said for a dog of his age, his symptoms are just like very minor. So he's in the early stages of the disease, which is a good sign. The doctor also said that I have to be prepared. I have to mentally prepare myself that the seizures are going to come. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
He's not in pain, which is good. He got medication today. He got his first pill. So we'll see how that works out. And I seriously ordered doggy sunglasses now for him.
Good.
Because I also talked to the doctor that he's stressed out when being in the car, and he's blinking a lot during the day. And he said, it's probably because of the photosensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
Is it photosensitivity?
That's right.
In English? Yeah. So I ordered doggy sunglasses.
I love that.
That's a sentence I never thought I'd gonna say, but here we are.
No, I wonder if you could I just got our car windows tinted extra dark.
We can do that as well, right?
Yeah. because of my photosensitivity. So that might be an easy way. If he has trouble in the car, that might help. But Blossom, our dog Blossom, always used to wear goggles, sunglasses, like doggy sunglasses, because she liked to stick her head out the window. So we just wanted to protect her eyes if she wanted to catch a breeze. And they're the cutest. He's going to look adorable in his little goggles. I can't even wait.
So it's at least some good news in the bad news, I think.
I mean, I think the news is bad. But yeah. I think what you've now heard is we're in the best possible place of a bad situation.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we just have to be grateful for that. And I think probably there are some folks out there in the Facebook group who can give you support around dogs having seizures, because that's also not an uncommon thing. And the most important thing to remember is it's traumatic for you. It won't really be traumatic for him.
Do you have something good?
I do. My something good is that I got to meet up with a friend of the show and your real life friend, and now my real life friend, Ingrid, and her sister, Kirsten, who were in the States and in New York to celebrate Kirsten's 50th birthday, which, girl, gorgeous, don't look 50. Gorgeous, gorgeous, both of them. And they took the train to Boston for the day. So Paul was able to take the afternoon, and we picked them up at the train station, and it ended up being a terrible traffic day. So we kind of drove them around in traffic a lot. But we had such a nice lunch, and I so enjoyed meeting them, and they brought me the nicest bag of goodies from Germany, which I think we've pretty much devoured. It was amazing. I miss them already, and I think they're going to be coming back next spring.
For everybody wondering who, if you listen to the episode where we interview my friend about her husband being kidnapped, that's her.
Mm-hmm.
That's Ingrid.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think we need to do another Tell Me Everything with Ingrid about her whole family, well, and also the family and like the adoption story. Wild. Yeah.
Did she tell you about her stalker?
No, I didn't hear about the stalker yet.
That's such a good story as well.
All right, I got to hear about that.
So please do us the favor, write us a rating and or review on your podcast app. Leave us comments under our YouTube videos, under our Spotify episodes. Recommend us to friends, family, colleagues in social media groups that ask for recommendations for this kind of true crime that is more on the history side of events. And that's it. Send us messages. We love them. It's very helpful, very supportive. We always enjoy hearing from you.
Yes, we do.
Check out our webpage, freshhellpodcast.com. There you'll find all the links to our email address, which is freshhellpodcast@gmail.com, to our merch store, to our Patreon, to our Facebook group, which is the loveliest group of little weirdos out there in the world.
It's the best.
That's it. Please tell your pets we said hi, hug them, cuddle them, kiss them, give them treats, take them to the vet. Be kind to them. Be kind to your fellow human being. And the hardest part of it all is be kind to yourself.
That's right. And remember, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.